by as a way of introduction, thanks so much everyone for coming on the course. It's going to be 7 lessons, so it's going to be 4 lessons this week and 3 lessons next week. And as you will have kind of picked up by now, what we're going to do is have a mixture of it over email and over WhatsApp with the group for you to communicate with. And then each day at this time, 4 o'clock South African time, we're going to have an hour or like a 40-minute session, basically, where you can ask questions about what you've come across in the lesson and the task that's set in the lesson as well. So the idea is that it can kind of mix in with your job. I don't want, because I think we're all aware of trainings where people have, they're trying to juggle their job at the same time. And hopefully this can kind of mix in with the work that we all have to do during the day. So hopefully that works well for you. And I'm really excited by this idea of people from our community coming together and learning how to make investigative podcasts. So I think that's something that we're all very interested in. I'm very passionate about. There's just one other moment which might have been confusing, is that we're in the middle of a rebranding into an organization called Develop Audio. And in terms of the training, in terms of the offering, in terms of our community, it's all very much the same. Like nothing's going to be taken away, but hopefully it'll give us the opportunity to add more things. So up until this point, we've been offering people a chance to get in contact with us with ideas and pitches and things like that around stories. But we want to sort of add to that and help people and introduce a course around helping people develop their audio projects. And that doesn't have to be a whole nonprofit or a whole company or anything like that. It can actually just be like an idea. If you think about it, like a podcast show is kind of a small project, right? Like an audio project, but you might have something else in terms of training around, for example, community radio stations in your country or something like that. So something that's audio based, something that's a project, which isn't necessarily a story. We also want to start helping people in developing courses to help people around that. Part of it around monetization, part of it around just development and thinking of ideas and thinking of, if, not everything has to be a for-profit business, can also be non-profit. And then you have to go the fundraising route. So we want to just open up those conversations because we think it's really important in the audio space to be able to have a place for African journalists to kind of think about projects that they might, and initiatives that they might want to start. So that's just the one thing. So if you're getting things from Develop Audio, that's the same as Alibi Investigations, basically. And those are 2 of the same things. Alibi Investigations is basically going to be a project within Develop Audio going forward. So let me put it over to you. What is, anyone wants to say anything? Maybe because it's the first session, people might want to introduce themselves or just have a few words about the lesson or about other things. What does anyone have anything to say at this point? Okay, I'm gonna just I keep thinking that the people that are muted, the unmuted, are gonna say something. So I'm just sorry, I'm just muting you because it's makes me think that you're gonna say something. Okay, so if no one's got anything to say, but as I say, like, you can post it in the chat afterwards. What we're also gonna do with these calls is that we're gonna record. One of the reasons why we're doing them on Zoom is so we can record them and then we'll put them onto YouTube afterwards. So we'll post the link in the group. So if you don't pick up something or you're busy doing something at the same time and you want to get back to it, then you can check out the calls on YouTube. Okay, I just want to say a few things around pitching and choosing your story for an investigative podcast. Now, you will have seen that in the materials that I've posted on WhatsApp and on email, but I think I just want to stress that, like, not every investigation works well as an investigative podcast series. And I think that's a crucial thing to kind of know, like, and on the one hand, we're not just talking about things that are very successful, but also the things that cannot translate well to audio. And this may seem obvious, but it's if you don't have people that can articulate or explain your story very well, then that means you can't do it in audio, right? I mean, it's as simple as that. You can use plenty of voiceover, you can script it and you can speak it. But as we are all journalists, and we all know that like journalism is about other people, and we kind of want other people to be able to tell this story as well as the journalist, as well as who is essentially a narrator in an investigative podcast. And you need people that can tell you the story that you want to tell in the language that you want to tell it in an efficient way. In the same way that when people talk about a story being visual, like I've never really worked in TV, but when people have worked in TV, when they talk about that, it means it has to have good visuals. And if they don't get those good visuals, then that means they can't do that story for television. Maybe in those situations, an audio version of it might actually be better. So I'm just got a question here. How can one just got a question saying, how can one determine which story would be good for a podcast? And that's a great question. I mean, really, that first point, the idea that you have people that can explain things articulately, so it's good for audio. Because even though we're going to get into it a little bit later in the week, the idea of collecting atmospheric sound and building scenes and scripting detail, you know, if you see something exciting, you script that in, like you're really painting a picture. You also need people to explain what's going on, and sometimes that's a narrator and sometimes that's other people. So that's the first thing. You need people, you need the audio. It seems obvious, but it's actually not always a thing that people think about if they haven't worked in audio before. If they've worked primarily in print, they get kind of used to the idea that you can just kind of write around quotes and kind of you can take, I don't want to say shortcuts because I used to be in print, but you can get away with a lot because you are the master of what you're creating in print in a lot more in a lot larger way. You have a lot more control to some extent in print. So, and I think the next thing in terms of determining which story makes a good podcast is character, right? You have to have interesting characters because that is what is going to keep people listening. You can have a story, you can have a theme, you can have a good like gotcha investigation moment, but really what you need is exciting characters that people want to spend time with. And you know, the format that we're looking at is these sort of multiple episode investigations, and not everything has to be like that, obviously, but that's, you know, for the sake of this course, that's sort of what we're thinking about, this sort of like 3 to 6 to 8 to 10 episodes that you're telling one story over all these episodes. And but let's face it, even if you're telling like half an hour of audio, you still need compelling characters to hold that story together, because people will be interested in your story and the details and learning things, but really what they want to see really what they want to see is a character go through something, you know, and or at least a character that they want to spend time with. So that's the second thing, is that you have to, and this kind of extends the idea that you have to spend more time with these people that you're interviewing to kind of paint them as more complicated characters. And I think that's an interesting point, in that like often what we do is, if we think about the other end of the spectrum in terms of audio, of the vox pop, right? We've all done at some point in our careers probably a vox pop, in that we kind of, some news event has happened and we've our editors probably told us like, go get out and get some vox pops, and we go out into the street and interview a bunch of people and get their opinions and put that into a package, right? If you think about that, and there is a place for that, but what we're talking about in this course is basically the complete opposite of that. We're not talking about just random faceless people spouting the odd opinion. We're really trying to get into the idea of like a character and their motivations and why they do things. So for example, if we're doing something around like I did a story a few years ago, and I'll post the link here, about an assassination of a high school teacher. Okay. And we did that story, and then we found a cop and his son who were investigating the case in the community. So this was in KZN. And basically the son, he was now out of school, but he was in high school and witnessed the assassination. He was literally in the class when the high school teacher was killed. So he saw it. He saw what happened. and he saw the two assassins come in and shoot his teacher. And then he had a police officer father who wasn't on the case officially, but he was, in his spare time trying to solve this case, if you like. And then the two of them were committed, and they kind of bonded as father and son over the solving of this case and over trying to figure it out and trying to find the killers. And then more importantly, the people that had ordered the hit. Okay, so that was so as a journalist, you've got this assassination case, but then as a storyteller, as someone who's trying to make this story more real and more interesting, and also trying to communicate the importance to the community that it's affected, those characters become incredibly important, because there's two people that are kind of completely traumatized. The kid more so. I mean, I say kid, he's like 19, but they're completely traumatized, but they're trying to do something about it, and they're trying to investigate it, and they're kind of pushing the story forward. So they, it's not just a journalist going into a community that they don't know about and trying to solve a case or trying to look into a case. You've got these other people who are deeply affected by it. They're also trying to solve the case. And I think we can all see that that is much more compelling as a journalist for a story. So that's a main thing that we need, is character. So it's the first is audio, the second is character. And the third thing for these kinds of stories, in terms of the multiple episodes that we've kind of become familiar with in podcasts, even long audio, even if it's like an extended amount beyond like a package for radio, you need twists and turns in your story. So you can't just have something that's like the whole story you can basically explain in one sentence. It's good to have like a one sentence summary, like we're talking about in terms to pitch it, but really you're going to need more meat on that bone. You're going to need more story. And it's kind of like, so this happens, then this happens, and then it concludes like this. And that is maybe, of these three things that I'm talking about, that's the most difficult thing to find, because I think as journalists, we all find interesting stories, and we all find stories that we want to tell, but stories that work in terms of having almost like a three-part structure, if you like something happens at the beginning, something happens in the middle, and then it concludes in some way. That's very difficult to find. It's very difficult to find. And then once you've got it, it's actually quite difficult to construct. So even if the story is sort of staring you in the face, knowing when a story begins, where actually a story begins and where it ends, in order to tell a satisfying story, is not always as easy. And we're going to get into script writing and those sort of elements later in this course. But those three things, I think, are important to start thinking about. Like, I'm sure we've all of you have stories that are interesting, but now we're trying to identify what of those interesting stories will make good podcasts, will make good audio stories. And that's the sort of first step. So does anyone have any thoughts on that? Anything to add on that in any way? No? Okay. That's totally fine. So now, the next part is basically, I just want to talk a little bit about the task. So I'm not going to go through everything that I sent. You guys can do that on your own time. But I just wanted to sort of touch on a few things like that. And now I just want to touch on this task, because each day we're going to have a task for you guys to do. And then we can talk about that in the following session tomorrow. So today's task is to pitch your story in a variety of ways. So you need to present your story in the form of a 2-line pitch. That's why I said it is good to have this like the thing, we all know it when we see it, right? That like 2-line pitch that when you hear it, you're like, wow, I need to either read or listen or watch or commission that story. Okay, so I want you guys to think about the stories that you've got cooking. And I don't want to restrict you. So this can be a story that you've already done, if that's easier for you in terms of print, but I don't want you to have done it in audio. I mean, that's, I think, key. So if you've done the investigation in print and now you want to think about turning that into audio, or it's a story you haven't done at all, I think those two options are best. So we want the 2-line pitch and then a paragraph version. So like of the story, like a paragraph of what's going on, and then a one pager. So I think, in my experience, for your own benefit, and in that one pager, you must try and cover as much of the story as possible. So in terms of the 3 acts that I was talking about, this isn't just like a page of lots of information about your topic, because I think that's the thing that we're trying to, and there is room for that kind of journalism, that kind of stories. But what we're dealing with here is like storytelling in that way. So in that one page, you want a sense of like, how is it going to end? Like, what is going to happen in the conclusion? Because as we know, people that invest a lot of time, if it's like a docu-series, because this is essentially what we're talking about, right? Like an audio documentary series. So if you watch a 4-part docu-series on Netflix, how it ends is really important. Even though as journalists, that's not really how we're trained, right? We're not trained to think of stories like that. Like stories, the most important ones have impact. And it doesn't really matter the story as such in terms of storytelling, right? In that way. But I guess I would argue that in today's age of how people consume media, if you want people to consume your stories, you need to start thinking in strong storytelling, strong narratives, strong characters, because there is sort of an idea that people have low attention spans. And obviously TikTok and things like that, they make a good case for that, right? Like people just want to consume stuff in 10-second bites. However, we all know people of all ages have spent a whole weekend watching one TV show. Now that sort of points the opposite is true. Like people do have attention span, but only for certain things, and only for things that have strong stories and strong characters and strong ideas of where a story is going, right? And I think the journalism boom, or the side of journalism that is booming, is the side that plays into that very strongly. And I guess I'm trying to encourage you to, if you haven't already, to kind of think more along that. So in this task, this idea of writing a one pager, we need the ending on that. We want like the whole, as much as you have in terms of how, and let's be clear about this. This stuff changes, right? We're not fiction writers. We're not like we make it all up and then pitch it. We're like, this is fluid and this changes out in the field. It changes with a story or even a phone conversation. So that's, I'm not trying to push for that not to happen, but I just think that in this kind of instance, what you want to be doing is doing everything as you see it at this moment and being completely willing to change it if you have to. And I think that can really start to help you start to think about things in a really strong storytelling way. And I don't mean that you're not already, but in this kind of storytelling, in audio, like documentary, podcasting, like tension, like, and we'll talk a bit more about that tomorrow, but tension is key. Like this idea of like what is happening next, and the listener really on the edge of their seat in terms of where this is going is really important. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to script that and how to create that tension. But is there any, I'm going to carry on, but is there any other thoughts or questions at this point? Okay. Okay, no problem. So then a few other things that I just want you to think about in terms of this one pager for this task is how many episodes you envision. And this might be very common for some of you. It might be less common for other people in terms of thinking of something as having multiple episodes. It's obviously something we're all aware of in terms of media that we've consumed, but in terms of producing something, this might be new. So this is kind of what people are asking now when they accept pitches for these kinds of series, is how many episodes, and I think that that's a really important thing, right? Because we're trying to think about like who will commission this story, right? And on one part of that is how many episodes you envision. And the thing that we're going to talk about tomorrow in terms of writing and in terms of structure isn't just how many episodes, but it's like how does that first episode end? because that's the key, right? Like people, the thing about multiple episode storytelling, on the one hand, it's very exciting and you've got people almost locked in once they've subscribed. But I think we all know that most people will say something like, oh, I'll listen to the first episode, or I'll give the first episode a try. And the thing is in that kind of realm, if you don't give them a reason to click on the second episode, then they won't, frankly, you know? So I just want to stress that this kind of storytelling for journalists is really compelling because you have so much space compared to in the past to tell a really complicated story. And that's maybe reaches back to my first point in this idea that like you can't tell you don't want to tell something in this kind of format which is thin, which is not dense, is not complex, because you just have so much time. You don't want people to feel that you've just padded it out. Then you should just make a package or something like that, and that's also fine. Like, I'm not trying to say that is worse or better. It's really like, this is the kind of format for very complicated stories that actually, if you told in a different way, you just would not have the space for them. So you want to be in the opposite place when you're thinking about which kind of story makes a good podcast series. You want to be thinking like, even with 4 episodes or 6 episodes, you're going to have to cut stuff, and it's too much stuff even for this many episodes, right? And that's where you want to be in terms of the complexity of the story. You don't want to be sitting in a kind of place where you're like, oh my goodness, how can I stretch this to 4 episodes or 5, or because that's what people are asking for. You definitely don't want to be doing that. If you're thinking like that, even slightly, like back to our original point, this is not the right story for you. Haven't chosen the right story for this. So that's another thing that I would stress. But yeah, I would take this task sort of casually, just try and think through what you've got on your back burners, what you've done recently, maybe it's also a story that you like feel that you've done, but like I say, like you didn't have the space to really get everything you wanted to say into it. And I think that frustration is where journalists are finding this type of podcast storytelling really valuable, in that they've actually done the work, the investigative work, but in terms of the final product that people are able to consume, maybe in a relatively short article, they feel a little bit shortchanged, like their work wasn't really displayed properly. And then because you've done the investigation, this is an opportunity to really flesh that out. So that's what I would say about those things. Are there any other thoughts or questions or any kind of comments at this stage? Yeah, if you don't need to raise your hand, just go for it. Just unmute and just speak.
Oh, my question was in the chat, actually. If there's a...
Oh, sorry.
No problem.
Oh, you can just say it, so just go for it.
Oh yeah, so I wanted to find out if there was like if there's like a best practice for like how long, or standard for how long a multi-episode podcast should be, or if it's dependent on the story. Like, how do you make those decisions, if it's like 30 minutes, 15 minutes, or like an hour?
Yeah, that's a great question. Can you just introduce yourself just for the team, just for the group, and where you're from?
My name is Ayodeji. I'm from Nigeria, and I'm a journalist.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a really good question. And I, in some ways, these things become very set in stone, the more mature like this kind of podcasting becomes. But on the other hand, you can do what you want in that way. I have found that the best practice is to try as hard as you can to make all your episodes the same length, no matter what you choose as that length. And I would say that an hour is the absolute max for this kind of thing. I think an hour, if you're on a multiple episode investigation, is kind of on the long side, to be honest. But I think the key thing I have found is that what you want, maybe with the last episode as an exception, because people kind of are okay with the last episode being either a bit shorter or a bit longer. I think if you're like, I mean, and often it will be determined by your first episode, maybe, right? But it's actually, the more of this I do, the more these things, I guess I've kind of programmed myself to kind of come out at about 30 minutes. And I And in terms of my personal preference, in terms of consuming this media, I find that that's the best for me. But actually, like people always say, is a lot of this stuff, especially with audio, but especially on demand content, is it's because you're trying to fit in with when people are doing something else. So, 30 minutes is pretty good in terms of how long it takes people to drive to work or do something, do like one unit of activity, and then you're basically filling that space. But I think the most important thing is to kind of, when people are now in your series, they don't want something that's like 10 minutes and then 40 minutes and then 15 minutes and then all over the place. And actually, just in terms of structure, it's actually harder for you. It might feel like you need to be more disciplined to do that, but it'll actually be harder for you to kind of keep the pace if you're all over the place in terms of length. So I would just, if you can pick one kind of length and stick with it, and have like, say, 50 minutes as your max, and I guess something like maybe 15 minutes as your minimum, I think you got a lot to play with in that way. Are there any other questions? Any other thoughts?
Thank you. I'm Richard Kimba from Zambia.
Hi, Richard.
My concern, yes, thank you. My concern is how protected are we as journalists, because other professions, they are protected more than us. You may find maybe you're investigating a story. I don't know if there are some association where someone's supposed to be affiliated, so that when you are doing an investigative story, you are free. As just a suggestion or a submission.
I lost you there. Can you just repeat the end of that question again?
I said, when you are doing investigative stories, maybe if you want to become someone who is protected when you are doing investigative, is there any association that someone can be affiliated?
Yes, that's a great question. We have done work in the past with the Committee to Protect Journalists, the CPJ. And I'm happy to share their details in the chat. And they're very reliable and very good to kind of talk through if it's either like safety training or if it gets more serious than that. They are strongly something that I would recommend in terms of protecting journalists and the work that you might be doing. We've referred a number of journalists to them in the past. If it's more the idea of protecting your sources in terms of audio rather than print, which I know is more difficult, that's also something that we can talk through as well. Maybe also on the chat, because I think that's also important if you're kind of used to being able to change people's names and just make people almost disappear, and now you kind of want to use their voice, but they need to be a voice that you can't distinguish. I think we can also talk about that as well. But I'll put the details of the Committee to Protect Journalists in the chat, because I think they're very useful, and they're very good people. I'm sure you've probably heard of them before, but I would really recommend them in terms of safety, especially for African journalists. They're really committed. Okay, great. Are there any other thoughts or just any other comments that people want to make to the rest of the group?
For me, it's not really a comment. For me, it's like a big opportunity, especially in Zambia. We don't have much people who are doing investigative studies. So this session for me is helpful.
Okay, great. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
Really humbled.
Great, Richard. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gilisha from DRC, and I want to thank you for the opportunity that you give us in order to perform well in audio podcast. But my question is how to deal with sources, because when you have to work on the podcast, the main thing is to have sound or voices.
Yes.
And the problem is, especially in my country where there is mining, and when you know about energy transition, it's a subject that is on mainstream media. And when you want to work on podcast, you have to take voices. So how to sources in order to get these voices?
Well, I mean, I'm open to other people's suggestions, but what we have found is that you can doctor the voice if you like. But actually what I found quite recently is good. So you can doctor the voice in terms of you scramble it, in terms of you cannot identify what the voice is. But the problem with that is if you scramble it to the extent that you actually need to scramble it, it actually becomes very, as you can imagine, quite difficult on the ear, you know, which is understandable. The other thing that we found recently, which is a bit of it, which you've always been able to do, but has become much better in the last few months, is to use synthetic voices. So you can use an organization called, the best one that we found is called 11 Labs. I'll post the link in the chat after this call, and you can produce a synthetic voice of what your source said, like kind of like an actor. But and an actor is another option, but like as we all know, like employing an actor to kind of voice probably what a source has said is probably usually from most people outside of their budget. In the past, that's what most people have sort of found. So this is an opportunity to kind of basically employ an actor, if you like, and use a synthetic voice, a fake voice, which sounds real, and it protects your source. It's a completely made up voice that they can't identify and can't source to anyone. And it gets the job done in terms of like getting across what you're trying to say without it sounding like a scrambled robotic voice, which often can be, as we know, like very jarring. So that the 11 Labs is what I would recommend at the moment. And I'll post the link on the chat. And if you have any other questions, you can also just follow up there, and I'm happy to help you. Great. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, if there are, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. Wait, sorry, I haven't been, there might be, oh no, that's the chat that we've got. Okay, so if there are any other questions that come to mind after this call, please don't hesitate to post them. I'll be posting this video of this call up on, I'll be uploading it to YouTube and putting that link in the chat as well. So thanks very much, everyone. This has been great. It's great to have you guys here across Zoom and WhatsApp and over email and on chat. And I think we're all going to make some very exciting podcasts by the end of it. So I'm really happy to have you guys here. I'm really, always excited to have new journalists like embark on this course. As I said, like this is the second cohort that we've had on this investigative podcasting course. And hopefully we'll have many more in the future. So I'm looking forward to the rest of this week, and have a good evening.